Mametz is a village on the D64 road, about 20 miles northeast of Amiens and 4 miles east of Albert.Fricourt lies to the west, Contalmaison is to the north, Montauban to the northeast, and Carnoy and Maricourt to the southeast. Mametz Wood is 1,000 yards to the northwest, and before 1914, the village was the fifth largest in the area, with about 120 houses and had a station on the line from Albert to Péronne. During the Battle of Albert 1914, the II Bavarian Corps attacked westwards north of the Somme but was fought to a standstill east of Mametz. Reinforced by the 14th Reserve Corps, the Germans on the north side of the Somme attacked again and took Mametz on the 29th of September, after a mutually costly battle for Fricourt, where the French were eventually forced out. The front line stabilized and both sides began to dig improvised defenses. In mid-December, the French conducted a local attack in the Mametz area but were repulsed with many casualties. Mine warfare began soon after a front line was established, but the most extensive mining took place further north at La Brosselle, and during 1915, the area around Mametz became a comparative backwater. The Germans began systematic fortification of the area, according to a directive from Erich von Falkenhayn, the German Army Chief of Staff, to fortify the western front so that a small number of infantry could defend the front indefinitely, and later in the year began work on second and third defensive positions. But in the Somme area, the defenses north of the Bapaume-Albert were improved first, and by July 1916 the first position defenses around Mametz were extensive, but the second position was a shallow trench and the third position had only been marked out. In June 1916, the British preliminary bombardment cut much of the barbed wire protecting the Mametz defenses and destroyed many of the trenches in the first position, occupied by Reserve Infantry Regiment 109 of the 28th Reserve Division. When the 7th Division advanced behind a creeping barrage, much of the German front line was quickly overrun and many prisoners taken. Delays further forward caused the infantry to lag behind the barrage and suffer far more casualties. Mametz was occupied during the morning by the 20th Brigade, but a German counter-attack forced most of the British troops out, until a second attack during the afternoon, when the advance of the 18th Division on the right flank had cut the Germans in the village off from Montauban to the east. The German defense collapsed and the 7th Division reached all its objectives on the right and in the center and began to consolidate, ready to receive a German counterattack. British and French attacks south of the Albert-Bapaume road continued on the 2nd of July and by the 13th of July had pushed up close to the German second position, through Mametz Wood to the north of Mametz, ready for the Battle of Bazentin Ridge on the 14th of July, the 7th Division having been relieved by the 38th Division on the 5th of July. In 1918, the village was recaptured by German troops on the 25th of March, during Operation Michael, the German Spring Offensive, when the 17th Division, the 12th Division and the 1st Dismounted Brigade of the 1st Cavalry Division were forced to retire to the northwest. Mametz and the vicinity were retaken for the last time on the 26th of August by the 18th and 12th Divisions. Background: 1914. In 1914, Mametz was a village on the D64 road, about 20 miles northeast of Amiens and 4 miles east of Albert. The village of Fricourt was to the west, Contalmaison to the north, Montauban to the northeast, and Carnoy and Maricourt to the southeast. Mametz Wood was 1,000 yards to the northwest, and the village was the fifth largest in the area, with about 120 houses and had a station on the light railway from Albert to Péronne. The French 11th Division attacked eastwards north of the Somme, but after the French territorials were forced back from Bapaume, the division was ordered to defend bridgeheads from Maricourt to Mametz. The 2nd Bavarian Corps attacked on the 27th of September between the Somme and the Roman road from Bapaume to Albert and Amiens, intending to reach the Ancre and then continue westwards along the Somme valley. The 3rd Bavarian Division advanced close to Montauban and Maricourt, against scattered resistance from French infantry and cavalry. On the 28th of September, the French were able to stop the German advance on a line from Maricourt to Fricourt and Thiepval. The German 2nd Cavalry Corps moved northwards and was held up in the vicinity of Arras by the French 2nd Cavalry Corps. On the 29th of September, French artillery bombarded the area between Mametz, Carnoy and Maricourt, apparently directed by a hidden observer in Montauban, and during the evening a German flank guard was put out facing Mametz in case of a French counter-attack. The 14th Reserve Corps had arrived north of the Bavarians on the 28th of September and advanced down the road from Bapaume to Albert and Amiens, with the 28th Reserve Division advancing south of the road. On the 28th of September, Reserve Infantry Regiment 40 had led the advance and was ordered to reach Fricourt from the area of Mametz the next day. The attack succeeded, but French counter-attacks by the 26th Infantry Regiment got into Fricourt and stopped the German advance, before eventually being driven out. A lull in the fighting occurred and both sides began to dig in haphazardly, where the opposing lines had stopped moving, which was not always on easily defended ground. The lull ended towards the end of the year, with French attacks at Mametz, Fricourt and Auvillers from 17 to 21 December, which were costly for both sides, French losses being 400 to 500 men killed and 1,200 prisoners being taken. A local truce between Montauban and Mametz allowed the French to recover the wounded. On the front north of the Somme, the war went underground in 1915, with mining and countermining at depths of 60 to 70 meters, which made the occupation of front-line positions a time of great strain. In January, General Erich von Falkenhayn, the German chief of the General Staff Oberstheeresleitung, ordered a reconstruction of the defenses which had been improvised as mobile warfare had ended on the Western Front late in 1914. Barbed wire obstacles were enlarged from one belt 5 to 10 yards wide to two belts 30 yards wide, about 15 yards apart. Double and triple thickness wire was used and laid 3 to 5 feet high. The front line had been increased from one trench line to 3, 150 to 200 yards apart, the first trench occupied by sentry groups, the second for the bulk of the front trench garrison, and the third trench for local reserves. The trenches were traversed and had sentry posts in concrete recesses built into the parapet. Dugouts had been deepened from 6 to 9 feet to 20 to 30 feet, 50 yards apart and large enough for 25 men. An intermediate line of strong points about 1,000 yards behind the front line was also built. Communication trenches ran back to the reserve line, renamed the second line, which was as well built and wide as the first line. The second line was sited beyond the range of Allied field artillery, to force an attacker to stop and move guns forward before assaulting the line. Later in 1915, the area around Mametz became a backwater. After the Second Battle of Artois in 1915, a third defense line another 3,000 yards back from the Stützpunktlinie was begun in February and was almost complete on the Somme front when the battle began. German artillery was organized in a series of Streifen. Each officer was expected to know the batteries covering his section of the front line and the batteries ready to engage fleeting targets. A telephone system was built with lines buried 6 feet deep for 5 miles behind the front line, to connect the front line to the artillery. The Somme defences had 2 inherent weaknesses which the rebuilding had not remedied. The front trenches were on a forward slope, lined by white chalk from the subsoil and easily seen by ground observers. The defences were crowded towards the front trench, with the regiment having 2 battalions near the front trench system and the reserve battalion divided between the Stützpunktlinie and the second line, all within 2,000 yards and most troops within 1,000 yards of the front line, accommodated in the new deep dugouts. The concentration of troops at the front line on a forward slope guaranteed that it would face the bulk of an artillery bombardment, directed by ground observers on clearly marked lines. Much of the new defense building on the Somme was done first in the area north of Fricourt and work further south through Montauban to the river had not been completed by the 1st of July. For nearly a year after the French offensive north of the Ancre, the area became a backwater and the divisions became known as the Sleeping Army. In May 1916, increased activity behind the British front line indicated that an offensive was being prepared. When Reserve Infantry Regiment 109 moved into the area of Mametz and Montauban in mid-June, the defences were seen to be poor and that there had been far less fighting in the sector than around Le Bossel and Auvilliers. Telephone connections were inadequate and there had been little stocking of supplies and ammunition around the front line. By July, Reserve Infantry Regiment 23 had been brought up to Montauban, east of Reserve Infantry Regiment 109. Prelude. British offensive preparations. Early in May 1916, preparations for the offensive quickened and long convoys of lorries and carts moved constantly on roads behind the front line. After dark, trains delivered ammunition and material was carried to the front line. New trenches were dug and sandbag revetments were constructed for gas cylinders. The woods behind the British front line filled with men and guns. The Germans were little able to impede the preparations due to lines of balloons, from which observers detected all daylight movement behind the German front line and directed heavy artillery fire on it. British aircraft flew over the German lines unopposed, photographing German defences and lines of communication, bomb shelters and artillery emplacements and strafed parties of infantry and cavalry. When German observation balloons ascended, they were attacked by aircraft and shot down. 15th Corps held the front line from just west of Carnoy to the Becourt Wood junction with 3rd Corps. The front line was along the end of the Fricourt salient, the village being one of the main bastions of the German front line between the Somme and the Ancre. The slopes of the Bazentin Ridge are cut by the Willow Stream and smaller rivulets in depressions which merge between the Mametz and Fricourt spurs. The Central Valley is west of Mametz Wood. To the east lies Caterpillar Valley and Contalmaison Valley lies to the northeast. Willow Stream was made the boundary of the 7th Division and the 21st Division, the 7th facing north along the Mametz spur below the village and the 21st facing east along the west face of the Fricourt spur. British plan of attack. In a first phase, the 7th and 21st Divisions were to capture high ground either side of the Willow Stream and Mametz. In the second phase, Fricourt was to be occupied and the advance pressed over the spurs to the 1st German intermediate line and then again along the 2nd intermediate line across the valleys south of Mametz Wood, gaining touch with the 13th Corps at White Trench and a quadrangle trench to the west with 3rd Corps. The second phase position was considered to be easy to defend against a counter-attack attack and provide a good view for artillery observers and covered positions for field artillery. If the two phases succeeded, the 17th Division would join the attacking divisions to attack through Mametz Wood up Caterpillar Valley to take Ginchy, Longueval and Bazentin-la-Grande. To avoid a frontal attack against Fricourt and the wood behind, the village was to be isolated by the first attacks and captured later. The right-hand brigade of the 7th Division was to capture Mametz and advance to White Trench, and the centre brigade was to form a defensive flank on the south side of Willow Stream. The left-hand brigade of the 21st Division was to cross the Fricourt spur and advance to Bottom Wood as the central brigade formed another defensive flank opposite the village and Fricourt Wood, ready for both brigades to attack as decided by the corps commander. In the 91st Brigade area, the foremost infantry were to assemble in the support lines to avoid casualties in the front line and advance to capture the end of the Mametz spur, the east end of the village, and consolidate the first objective along the line of Fritz Trench after an advance from 1,100–1,700 yards west of Pommier's Redoubt. Joining the 13th Corps in Battalion with the left flank along Bunny Alley to the northern fringe of the village, Edmonds' the 20th Brigade was to make a divergent advance to form a defensive flank opposite Fricourt by moving down the Carnoy Valley on the sides of the light railway and over the quarry spur on the left flank. Beyond the left flank was a 500 yards wide crater field full of German trenches and strong points which would need to be carefully mopped up. Despite the 4 mines to be sprung before 0 hour, the right-hand battalion was to capture the west end of Mametz and the north side of the valley, and the centre battalion was to occupy the steeper south side, with the inner flanks of the battalions meeting at the light railway hall. The battalions were then to advance to the objective at Bunny Alley and some of Orchard Alley. The left-hand battalion was to wheel leftwards over Quarry Spur, force the German out of the crater field and take Apple Alley, a southward branch of Orchard Alley. German defensive preparations. In late May 1916, the Somme front was reinforced to 8 divisions in line from Roye on the south bank north to Arras, with 3 divisions held in reserve. The Guard Corps with 3 divisions took over from Gomecourt to Serre, which reduced the frontage of the 14th Reserve Corps from 30,000 to 20,000 yards. The 28th Reserve Division, holding the line from Auvillers south to Maricourt. Recruit battalions of troops which were undergoing advanced training were moved closer to the front, to occupy the 2nd and 3rd positions if needed. The 2nd Army had about 240 guns and howitzers, which were outnumbered 6-1 by the British artillery. In early June the German defenders were confronted by British patrols, but the front was mostly quiet until the 20th of June, when British heavy guns began to bombard the area behind the German front line, as far back as Bapaume. Until the 23rd of June, the German front line opposite 15th Corps was held by most of Reserve Infantry Regiment 109, with the I Battalion and 3 Battalion distributed in shell hole positions around the front line and the 2 Battalion in support near Danzig Alley. The regiment was to have been relieved on the night of the 30th of June, the 1st of July, but only 1½ companies of Infantry Regiment 23 got through the British artillery fire, the rest collecting at Montauban. Deep dugouts in the front line had not been damaged, but there were a few dugouts in the rearward lines, which led to most of the garrison being congregated in the front trench. A second position existed about 3,000 yards further back from Maurepas to Guillemont, Longueville and the Bazentin villages, but was little more than a shallow trench. The artillery of the 28th Reserve Division was accurately bombarded during the British artillery preparation, and by the 1st of July many of the guns were out. of action. Telephone communication was cut and machine guns in Dancer Galley and the north end of Mametz were blown up by shells or made unserviceable. Preparatory bombardment on the 20th of June. British heavy artillery bombarded German communications behind the front line as far back as Bapaume and then continued intermittently until the evening of the 22nd of June. At dawn on the 24th of June, a shrapnel barrage began on the German front position and villages nearby. At noon more accurate fire began and in the evening a light rain turned the German positions into mud. On the 25th of June, heavy artillery fire predominated, smashing trenches and blocking dugouts, setting fire to supply dumps and causing large explosions in Montauban. Variations in the intensity of fire indicated likely areas to be attacked, the greatest weight of fire occurring at Mametz, Fricourt and Auvillers. During the night the German commanders prepared their defences around the villages and ordered the second line to be manned. After an overnight lull, the bombardment increased again on the 26th of June, then suddenly stopped. The German garrisons took post and fired red rockets to call for artillery support, and a German barrage was fired into no man's land. Later in the afternoon, huge mortar bombs began to fall, destroying shallow dugouts, and a super-heavy gun bombarded the main German strong points, as smaller guns pulverized the villages close to the front line, from which civilians were hurriedly removed. German troops billeted in villages moved into the open to avoid the shelling, and from 27–28 June, heavy rain added to the devastation, as the bombardment varied from steady, accurate shelling to shell storms and periods of quiet. At night British patrols moved about no man's land, and on the 30th Division front found German trenches lightly held. Raiders taken prisoner by the Germans said that they were checking on the damage and searching for German survivors. On the 27th of June, a larger explosion was seen in Montauban, and 2 raids during the night found German trenches empty, while a third party found more Germans above ground than the night before. German interrogators gleaned information suggesting that the offensive would begin on either side of the Somme and Ancre rivers at 5 o'clock a.m. on the 29th of June. All of the German infantry stood to along with reinforcements, but the bombardment resumed in the afternoon, rising in intensity to drum fire several times. Artillery fire concentrated on small parts of the front, then lines of shells moved forward into the depth of the German defenses. Periodic gas discharges and infantry probes continued, but German sentries watching through periscopes were often able to warn the garrisons in time. On the 30th of June, the bombardment repeated the earlier pattern, by when much of the German surface defenses had been swept away. Lookout shelters and observation posts were ruined and communication trenches had disappeared, particularly on the front of 13th Corps and 15th Corps. The headquarters of Reserve Infantry Regiment 23 was destroyed by a shell on the 23rd of June, and the systematic bombardment had by the 1st of July cut the wire around Montauban, destroyed the German trenches and hit the German artillery in Caterpillar Valley. The infantry took cover in the deeper dugouts, a shallow support trench. On the night of the 30th of June, the 1st of July, the bombardment fell on rear defences and communication trenches. Then at dawn, British aircraft filled the sky. Captive balloons rose into the air at 6:30 a.m., and an unprecedented barrage began all along the German front until 7:30 a.m., when the bombardment abruptly stopped. The remaining German trench garrisons began to leave the shelters and set up machine guns in the remains of trenches and shell holes, which proved difficult to spot and from which the occupants could face in any direction to engage an attacker.